Well, welcome again to our Tuesday evening teaching sessions, an opportunity to continue to look at passages of Scripture, perhaps in a slightly different way than we've been used to in the past. We're looking at Genesis chapter 1 through to Genesis chapter 11. And right from the very beginning, I've acknowledged the controversy and the debate and the differences of understanding that surround these chapters. But what I've tried to do is approach it in a slightly different way. I've merely set out to ask that question, what exactly is the author's intention? Why is the writer telling us this story? What questions are they seeking to address? And what can we apply to our own understanding of the rest of Scripture? Because, of course, this is right at the very beginning of the scriptural revelation which we have within our Bibles. So we're asking those important questions and trying, as it were, almost to go back to the origins of the story to see if that helps us to get some fresh insight. Last time we looked at Genesis chapter 8 through to chapter 9 and verse 17. And what we saw there straight away was the way that the author had used a particular narrative technique to expound his sense of this is the key moment in the story of the flood. And what we were saying simply was that chapter 8 and verse 1 is at the heart of the palistrophe, that particular technique that he employs. The outcome of that is, of course, we reach that defining moment where the story tells us that God remembers Noah. In other words, God is going to start acting on events and acting to bring about his will and purposes in a new way. That particular session opened up the opportunity to think through some of our early understanding of the covenant. And there we saw the covenant made prior to Noah entering the ark and subsequently after Noah and his family leave the ark. And what we saw there was a covenant that was not only made with humans, but also included the whole of creation. So it's an incredibly powerful image of a God who is seeking to enter into a new relationship with the whole of his creation. His creation that we've already been shown has gone so badly wrong. The second important theme that emerged out of that passage was the understanding of the sanctity of life. Again, not just human life, but all of life. And what we see here is the beginning of an unfolding story that will continue to journey through Scripture right up to the moment when Jesus brings the law to a sense of complete fulfillment. And what we see here is right from the start God's commitment to work with people where they were in the real world in trying to stem or to hold back the tide of revenge that was completely out of proportion with the crime that had taken place. And so here we see the establishment of a principle. The life taken is to be paid for by the loss of life of the person who has committed the crime. So it's life for life rather than life for 100 lives. That's how the world was at that time. So God is working in systematic stages towards a greater understanding of the sanctity of life, which of course applies to creatures which occupy God's created world too. The third element was, of course, the rainbow, which was significant in that it reminded us, and that was the intention of the author, that God is not about to go back to the floods, that God now will work with people as they are, and there won't be that sense of impending destruction, that God will covenant through the rainbow as the symbol of his covenant to continue in human life and engaging with it and working with it to bring about, of course, his ultimate plan of salvation. Today in this session, we're going to look at Genesis chapter 9 and verse 18 through to chapter 10 and verse 32. I'm going to read the rest of chapter 9, and then I'm going to leave chapter 10 to someone more capable of reading it than myself. This is my get out of jail card. I'm going to call upon David Suchet to read Genesis chapter 10 for you. It's a much better read than I could manage. So let me just read the latter part of chapter 9 for you, beginning at verse 18. The sons of Noah who came out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham was the father of Canaan. These were the three sons of Noah, and from them came the people who scattered over the whole earth. Noah, a man of the soil, proceeded to plant a vineyard. When he drank some of its wine, he became drunk, and he lay uncovered inside his tent. Ham, the father of Canaan, saw his father's nakedness and told his two brothers outside. But Shem and Japheth took garments and laid them across their shoulders. Then they walked in backwards, covered their father's nakedness. Their faces were turned the other way so that they would not see their father's nakedness. When Noah woke from the wine and found out what his youngest son had done to him, he said, "Cursed be Canaan. The lowest of slaves will he be to his brothers." He also said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem. May Canaan be the slave of Shem. May God extend the territory of Japheth. May Japheth live in the tents of Shem, and may Canaan be his slave." After the flood, Noah lived 350 years. Altogether, Noah lived 950 years, and then he died.
This is the account of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, Noah's sons, who themselves had sons after the flood. The sons of Japheth: Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshach, and Tiras. The sons of Gomer: Ashkenaz, Riphath, and Togarmah. The sons of Javan: Elisha, Tarshish, the Kittites, and the Rodanites. From these the maritime peoples spread out into their territories by their clans within their nations, each with its own language. The sons of Ham: Cush, Egypt, Put, and Canaan. The sons of Cush: Seba, Havilah, Sabta, Reamah, and Sabtika. The sons of Reamah: Sheba and Dedan. Cush was the father of Nimrod, who became a mighty warrior on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. That is why it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. The first centers of his kingdom were Babylon, Uruk, Akkad, and Calnu in Shinar. From that land he went to Assyria, where he built Nineveh, Rehoboth, Calah, and Resen, which is between Nineveh and Calah, which is the great city. Egypt was the father of the Ludites, Anamites, Lehabites, Naphtuhites, Pathrusites, Casluhites, from whom the Philistines came, and Caphtorites. Canaan was the father of Sidon his firstborn, and of the Hittites, Jebusites, Amorites, Girgashites, Hivites, Archites, Sinites, Arvadites, Zemarites, and Hamathites. Later the Canaanites' clans scattered, and the borders of Canaan reached from Sidon towards Gerar as far as Gaza, and then toward Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, and Zeboim as far as Lasha. These are the sons of Ham by their clans and languages, in their territories and nations. Sons were also born to Shem, whose older brother was Japheth. Shem was the ancestor of all the sons of Eber. The sons of Shem: Elam, Ashur, Arphaxad, Lud, and Aram. The sons of Aram: Az, Hul, Gether, and Meshech. Arphaxad was the father of Shelah, and Shelah the father of Eber. 2 sons were born to Eber. One was named Peleg, because in his time the earth was divided. His brother was named Joktan. Joktan was the father of Almodad, Sheleph, Hazamepheth, Jirah, Hadoram, Uzal, Dilah, Obal, Abimiel, Sheba, Ophir, Havilah, and Jobab. All these were sons of Joktan. The region where they lived stretched from Mesha towards Sephah in the eastern hill country. These are the sons of Shem by their clans and languages, in their territories and nations. These are the clans of Noah's sons, according to their lines of descent within their nations. From these, the nations spread out over the earth after the flood.
The author here is facing an enormous challenge. There's a problem that he has to seek a solution to. Somehow he has to get from the point where we are in the story, where Noah and his 3 sons, their wives, and Noah's wife, have come out of the ark. Somehow he's got to progress the narrative from that point to very quickly get to the story of Abraham, as we would refer to him now. It's a process that he has to employ several different narrative techniques to achieve. Meanwhile, he wants to explain to us how very quickly we're moving from one family to a family of Terah and Abram living in Ur. And so with that sense of other people being around and other nations existing and so on. And so that's the problem that the author faces. And to do that and to make that journey, he approaches it with great skill. He's using and employing some of those narrative tools that we've seen him use before. This time, he employs a table of nations rather than a genealogy. But first, to do that, he needs to tell us how the circumstances and situation of the 3 sons changes. And to do that, he tells us this, what I would describe as a slightly awkward story about Noah and the actions of his son. From going from that image of Noah as this obedient, unquestioning servant of the Lord, the one who builds the ark, the one who brings the animals into the ark, the one who is prepared to be entombed within the ark, and of course then to make that sacrifice once he comes out of the ark onto dry land. Up to this point, he's been very much our hero. But suddenly our hero degenerates into this drunken and shameful human being. We have to ask the question, why has the author chosen to go down this route? What's the point? Couldn't he have just overlooked this section of the story? It would have saved Noah's embarrassment and, of course, our questioning at this particular point. But as with all things, the author is very cleverly utilizing this situation to begin to tell us how the relationship between Noah and his three sons begins to change. And of course, how subsequently the relationship between the three sons themselves begins to change, and how that will affect the future in deeply significant ways. We're told that Noah becomes a man of the soil. And one of the outcomes of that is, of course, that Noah plants a vineyard. Well, he falls into a trap. Perhaps he's not aware of the consequences of enjoying too much wine. But what we see here is, of course, that this wine, too much wine, this indulgence on his behalf, leads him to become very drunk. And that, in turn, leads to a loss of personal dignity before his children. For those who are listening to the story, the readers of this particular story at the time when they would have done that, everything here undermines the values of traditional family life. The father gets caught out in a way that he shouldn't have done as the head of the clan, the family. The child, in this case Ham, treats his father in a shameful and disrespectful way. The older brothers redeem the situation by covering over the nakedness of their father, and of course they would have been applauded for doing such an act. They behave appropriately, and by that they maintain something at least of the dignity of their father. So why is the narrator telling us this story? How does he utilize this particular story? Well, there are some scholars who see this as having some overtones of sexual attraction between Noah lying naked and his son Ham, the response that he makes. In other words, they argue that what is happening here is that Ham looks impurely upon his father's nakedness before broadcasting the indecency that he's witnessed. Well, that's a particular view. I'm not going to go down that avenue today. I'm just going to highlight what I think is at the heart of what the author is trying to tell us. He's trying to explain the context for the way that the Canaanite people became such a threat to the people of Israel and often led them into gross immorality. So he's trying to set the scene for us, and he's talking to a generation who would have already experienced a lot of that here, right at the heart of Noah's story, and this particular incident is the root or the origins of the relationship between the Canaanites and the true people of God. They would become an irritant. They would become a source of danger, and they would become a source of temptation for the children of Yahweh. For it's out of the line of Ham, we're very quickly told, that Canaan comes. And it's Ham and his descendants who are cursed through Noah's response to this particular incident. And in contrast, of course, Japheth and Shem's children are blessed. So you can see there that the narrative is presenting us, in one sense, he's preparing us for the immediate, the future, what's happening within the nation at the time that he's writing, and of course the experience of the people that he is writing for that. And all of that then leads us very naturally into chapter 10, this table of nations, which David Suchet read so beautifully for us. So let's now move into thinking about chapter 10, what's described as a table of nations. And what we immediately see there is that the author is trying to move us from chapter 9 into chapter 11, the story of Terah and his son Abraham, better known as for many. And so what he does is he very quickly shows us how out of the three sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, these nations begin to emerge. And so they scatter and they begin to populate the ancient world as it would have been known to his readers and listeners. They wouldn't have had any grasp of life outside of the immediate, and we'll think about that in a particular moment. What is interesting as we look at the Table of Nations is how the order of the sons change. Throughout the story, from the story of Noah and the ark, it's always been Shem, Ham, and Japheth. But now it's interesting to see that he reverses the order almost. So it begins with Japheth, and then it goes to Ham, and then to Shem, which of course leads naturally and works very well into the relationship between Shem and, of course, Abram. And that's the link he's trying to make. So he's telling us in a geographical sense about the people, the descendants of Japheth, who seem to travel further away from the immediate context of the story that we're going to read about Abram in chapter 11 and chapter 12 and so on. He then focuses in on the development of the Canaanite people, which of course is going to affect the story of Abram, because he moves from Ur of the Chaldees through to Haran, and then Haran up into Canaan. So you can see what's happening. And then he goes into the story of Shem, and of course out of Shem's descendants comes Abram in that way. The clans that emerge out of Japheth are those who move furthest away from where this particular story is set. They begin to populate the coastlands around the Mediterranean, into Anatolia, and then into the Black Sea region. And of course, those particular people wouldn't necessarily have been on the immediate horizon as far as the author's readers and listeners were concerned. They were a long way away, and of course communication at this time was very sparse. And so in telling us about Japheth and his descendants, the clans that emerge out of his descendants, we get that picture of a people who are a long way off and probably very disconnected in one sense from the story that is about to unfold through God's covenant with Abram. He spends more time, the author, looking at the clans that emerge from Ham, probably to just tell us, or to highlight the fact that these were going to be the biggest threat to the way that God's plans were going to be unfolding. He also sets us up for that journey that Abram is going to make. As I say, that journey from Ur in Mesopotamia to Haran, and then up into Canaan. So he's creating that sense of when Abram gets to Canaan, this is who he's going to meet. These are the people that are going to be there. And there are the clans that come from Ham, his son, Noah's son Ham. And these clans and nations really occupy a number of different areas. Northeastern Africa, the eastern shores of the Mediterranean, and of course the shores of the Red Sea. The third group that he tells us about are the descendants, the clans, the nations that emerge out of the line of Seth. And that would have been the line that his readers and listeners would have identified with most. They would have seen them as their very own. These are our ancestors. And we're told that they mainly populate Mesopotamia and Arabia. So you can see the context there again is emerging for the story of Abram, which is where the narrator, the author, is trying to take us in a very short space of time. So this leads us into that setting of as far as the story of Abram is concerned. It's interesting the way that throughout we've seen that the author tends to unfold his story in very symbolic ways. And here again, that symbolism, that number, significant number, emerges, because what Genesis chapter 10 does, it introduces us to 70 descendant nations. And 70, of course, is deeply significant within the Jewish world. There are 14 that emerge from Japheth. There are 30 that come from Ham, and 26 that emerge out of Shem. And what's interesting is there is at times some overlap between the three lists, which is, I think, the author's attempt to tell us, even though now the story is well, it's already narrowed down to Noah and his family. Now it's exploding outwards. But then the story is going to narrow down again when we come into chapter 11, and we're going to be introduced to Abram. But I think what the author wants to tell us too is that in the spread of all these nations and the mutuality that they share, this is a reminder that God's care and his grace and his love is not just narrowing down to one specific family. His love, his grace, his compassion, his desire is to know all people everywhere. And so, although we go from the narrow to the wide back to the narrow, I think the author wants to say to us, don't miss out on the fact that the narrow were meant to be lights to the widest point, the other nations, which of course was Israel's calling to be a light to the Gentile nations. Let's just finish up today by thinking about what else is happening in the world around these particular events. The biblical narrative, of course, is like a seam of coal. And it just helps us to see what is happening in a particular narrow perspective. It isn't telling us everything that is going on around all these things. And there's no reason for us to assume that the author is trying to say to us at this point that this is all there are in terms of nations and people groups and tribes. I don't think the author is trying to say there aren't people and civilizations elsewhere in the world at this time. Well, of course there were. We know that from history. The author is setting his story in a world that was known to him and to his readers and listeners. There was a world outside that was unknown to them, which of course he can't comment about. Much of how we view all of that depends on the way that we view these particular stories. If we assume that the flood is universal, as many of course do, then of course we must understand that the ark must have contained creatures like, or animals like polar bears, and that the flood covered the whole of the Americas. If we believe that the flood was a localized event, then it's set in a world that was known to the author and his readers and listeners. And of course, that makes a significant difference. If we believe, as some do, that the story is a parable, then of course all of that is irrelevant. And it seems to me that all those questions are of no interest as far as the author is concerned. The author is only writing about the immediate, what is happening as God unfolds his salvic purposes, his plans of salvation. The author has little or no interest in any of that, doesn't come into his questioning. He doesn't describe the animals that go into the ark, doesn't name them. The author gives us that sense of this enormity of this flood, but there's no great claims about any of that. He leaves it to us to kind of work out what's going on in this way. A universal flood, a global flood, a localized flood, a parable, which helps us to understand something about God and the way that he deals with humanity. So that brings us into chapter 11, and next week we're going to get the opportunity to view the Tower of Babel, and then into the early reference to where the story is really going. And of course that is to the story of Abram and the covenant that God makes with Abraham and his descendants.